Hey everyone, it's Dr. Justin here again, and we're talking about space repetition again. And it's a very juicy topic, I know, and I cover this a lot. Um, but we're going to focus in on just what people misunderstand about space repetition. And I know that I've covered this before, but I feel that I need to cover this again to really clarify a few things and to convince the people that are not convinced, I guess, about what the issue with space repetition is. Because there are good things. It's just that you have to understand what the good things are and then what the limiting parts are. Because if you think that it's going to get you, all these amazing results, you frankly, just statistically, that's unlikely to happen. And I'm just gonna, in this video today, and through this conversation, my goal is to try to just make that really, really clear, where it is just so logical that that could not be the case. We've got Stephanie here, who's a student that's going through the course, has that sort of more technical knowledge about some of the techniques. We've got Marvin here, who is a professional as well as a student, looking at things from a slightly different angle. And so I'm going to start off by asking both of you, what is your experience personally in your own studying with space repetition, space retrieval, and using techniques, especially things like just Anki flashcards? Well, let me make this very, very clear because I don't want to get sued. I don't have anything against Anki in itself. I think it's good for what it was designed to do. I just think people don't understand what it is designed to do or the actual underlying research behind it and the extent and limitation of where that research starts and ends. Okay, so let me just make that super, super clear. All right, so there's nothing wrong with Anki. It's about how you're using the tool. All right, so what's your experience with that?
So yeah, it's a quite interesting question because I'm a heavy Anki user, or I used to be. I did, I don't know, in between 300 and 600 cards a day, and felt like, yeah, okay, I only have to go through my Anki cards every day, and then I will be good. And yeah, I improved, to be honest. So from C's, I made it to A minus to B minus in terms of degrees. But from time to time, I felt like, oh my god, the information do not stick, and I repeat the same question on the same day 5 times, and I'm like, how the hell I really can't memorize these things. So am I dumb? It's a regular question I ask myself.
Super, super common. And I would actually, ask the audience listening to this right now, like how many of you resonate with that story? Because I've already heard, this story or its variations, thousands of times. Your experience, Marvin, is probably the quintessential experience of most people that use Anki. Most people that use Anki are not finding that it's like completely catastrophically failing them. Most people are finding, yeah, it's getting me some results and it's actually better than when they weren't using it. But then there are all these sort of limitations. And the problem is that we start normalizing these limitations and we say, oh, that's just how learning is. It just has to be this way.
That's really interesting because for me, I actually didn't really use Anki a lot. I first heard about space repetition maybe 4 or 5 years ago. But even before that, I think it's really popular for people to use flashcards. And honestly speaking, I think I've always thought that it was overhyped. I mean, I had my own ways of studying before I joined the course and didn't really use flashcards or Anki or anything of that sort. And I looked at my friends all spending hours and hours and hours on flashcards. And meanwhile, they still weren't getting grades nearly as good. So I was wondering, something's clearly not right here.
So is that the reason that you thought it was overhyped?
I did, because I saw so many people wasting time and I felt I don't see the need. But then when I got introduced to Anki and the whole theory of space repetition, I thought, okay, extending the forgetting curve, that makes sense. You should have a regular revision schedule. Makes sense. So I decided to give it a try. But here's the thing. I did give it my best. I went into the whole Reddit rabbit hole, tried and to tinker around with the settings, but I realized I ended up wasting more time setting up Anki than actually studying with it. And in the end, I still felt like I remembered nothing. And I figured, okay, I'll just go back to my regular way of studying.
Here's the thing. I want to focus in on like one specific point that we talked about first, which is the idea of like, but it works, right? It works for me. Like, sure, you're saying that the theory of like spaced repetition and stuff, it's got its limitations. Sure, most people can accept that, but it works for me. What can I do in addition to this? Actually, I was running a workshop yesterday, and someone asked me this very same question. They said, well, it works for me. So what can I do in addition to what I'm already doing? But here's the thing. If you need to do something like 5 or 6 times in repetition for it to work, is it actually working or not? See, the only way that we can justify that it works is if we normalize the idea that information has to be repeated multiple times for it to stick. If that is if we rely on the fundamental premise that the only way that you're able to learn effectively is through multiple repetitions, then yes, it's very effective because it does exactly that. Except that's not the case. And in fact, we know that's not the case. In fact, if you think about it, we know that you're not having to always repeat things over and over again for literally everything that you learn. We know that you don't have to always learn in this way. We know that some piece of information we're able to hold on to for a long time without doing repetition, especially when it comes to things like instruments or hobbies or your favorite movie or your favorite book or sports that you play. You're not having to memorize this through repetition. And the human brain did not adapt to need to do that. You know, the example I often give is like back in like the gatherer hunter days when we were like living in caves and stuff, like we weren't walking around and then like, you know, at the fire pit every single night, like having our stone flashcard tablets with like, what is the angle at which I need to stab a deer? Like, where are the blueberries located? Like, you're not having to spaced repetition this in order to hold it in our heads. Like, the human brain adapted to be able to actually learn very effectively, but it's only able to learn effectively at stuff that it's meant to hold onto. Because if you just learn literally everything that you're exposed to, your brain would just explode. There's just so much. So your brain is having to actively filter things out. And so if it's irrelevant, it will forget it. So the problem here is that we're saying learning what I'm studying is irrelevant to me and my brain wants to forget it. Let me just smash it into my brain over and over again so that it holds onto the information. And therefore we're saying that this is effective learning, right? So some people often think that flashcards and spaced repetition and Anki is effective, but it's not time efficient. But actually it's the same thing. If it worked, you wouldn't have to do it so much. You wouldn't have to overcompensate with more repetitions and more time investment. So the reason it's not time efficient is because it is not effective. So the reason that we have this huge, big fixation on spaced repetition and things like Anki, and this is the research that it was all based on, was that the early research on spacing, and actually still research on spacing now, shows that there is a positive effect on your retention and your learning outcomes when you have spaced retrieval. It's a good thing to have. You should have some spaced repetition in there. What we're saying is not that you shouldn't have it. What we're saying is that we need to know what it achieves and what it doesn't achieve. And so the later research coming out, even in the just last sort of couple years, is saying that spaced retrieval and things like Anki, they're good for holding on to isolated random facts and information that seem seemingly irrelevant. But we do not think that it's good for problem solving. We do not think it's good for answering questions or retrieving on information in a more complex way. We do not think it's good for relating multiple things together. So any type of curveball question you get asked in an exam, Anki's not going to be good for that. We do not even know if it's useful for things, for larger, more complex pieces of information in itself. Something like learning concepts, we don't even think that it actually works for that. And research is even showing that it may only be useful for people that are operating at a lower level of cognitive capacity. So really, what we know is that spaced repetition of flashcards is an extremely common technique that's used by a lot of top achievers. It's also an extremely common technique used by every other type of achiever, including the people that fail. So it's just a common thing that's used by everyone. It doesn't mean that it's a secret weapon of top achievers. It's just literally the weapon that everyone uses, you know? It's like, it's not the bringing the gun to the knife fight. It's like wearing the shoes to go outside. It's like everyone is doing it. If you're not even wearing the shoes, like, you're probably at a disadvantage, but it's not going to be the thing that sits you at the very top. There's something else that's going on there. And so when we're thinking about how we're actually assessed on this information, as we get especially higher in education levels, the way that we're assessed is often not just at these lower levels of just, recalling a single fact. It's more about bringing multiple facts and multiple concepts together, creating kind of a web of understanding and expressing that. It's about discussing these ideas in more detail, right? We often have to do a lot of comparison between the ideas. We'll have to actually evaluate the quality of these ideas and concepts. We have to represent some of these different structures with each other. And any type of question that asks on that, which is especially senior high school onwards, if you're trying to reach higher grades, that's almost exclusively the way that you're differentiated from other students. Something like flashcards is not going to help with that at all. In fact, it's actually worse because it's going to take time away from you doing something else that actually would have been more effective. Because Marvin, as you were sort of talking about, how if you're doing 300 to 400 flashcards a day, you do not have time to do anything else. You barely have enough time to just breathe or exist, let alone like find a new method of studying that is actually going to work for you. So that's the key, is understanding this opportunity cost. Like, what are we losing by doing that, and understanding that there are actually alternatives. So the question there is usually, well, what are the alternatives? And the answer to that is, well, that's rather complicated. And there's a lot that we can talk about there. And I do talk about in other videos, and I'm not going to go through in depth right now here because there is a lot, but we do talk about that. And obviously those of you that are just wanting to jump into it, you can just jump onto the course that I've got. But there are alternatives and they do work. And in fact, I think it would actually be useful if you guys share a little bit about your experience, about how you found it. Maybe Marvin, more you, because definitely you sort of weren't really into the whole Anki space to begin with. But Marvin, like, how did things change for you when you started using some of the alternatives?
It was crazy because I felt disarmed. As you mentioned, Anki is a weapon, and the meta, or the most people are using at the moment, this weapon because of several videos which are out there till the point that you end up in Anki hell. Reddit users. Slow progress. I changed the whole system, and now Anki is only very superficial for me. It's more like I jump into a lecture, I did my pre-study thing. In the lecture, I make the right notes, I put it into a chunk map, and it sticks. It's so crazy. It's like magic. And before that, I had like 6 to 8 or maybe 10 Anki sessions, and then it sticked, but only it stick for the exam, and afterwards it went directly straight to garbage.
Yeah, that it's kind of like magic. It's actually not even magic. It's just literally how your brain works. When your brain feels the information is relevant and worth holding on to, it will naturally hold on to it, because that's literally what it was designed to do. It's just that this entire system of how we study is built on really outdated research. This is like 50 to 70 years old, the research. And then now, if you were to look at just the research in the last 5 years, more and more researchers are starting to realize it's not actually producing consistent results. A minority of students using this technique are actually getting these results, are actually getting good results. There's something that's not working here. People are just starting to wise up to that. But experience, anecdote, like real world practical experience and research always is delayed. There's usually like a 10 to 20 year delay between that. Once practitioners realize something's up before the research can pick up on it, because you have to get like funding and do the research and conduct the studies and publish it. It takes a long time. So when researchers are starting to figure it out, it's already been there. Someone's noticed it for years, right? And so now over the last couple of years, world leading researchers, they're publishing on this, the limitations of space retrieval and spacing, what it does do well and what it doesn't do well.
But what is the smoothest transition into a more effective way of space repetition?
It depends on how entrenched you are in the Anki system. If like your be all end all is Anki, and again, I'm not necessarily talking about the app. I'm talking about the kind of the process. Space retrieval. There's other apps that do the same thing, right? But this whole just like heaps and heaps of flashcards, space retrieval type algorithm. If your whole system is based on that, that's going to be very difficult to extract yourself from. Okay, to be honest, because so much of it is dependent on that. I would say that a good first step to take is to look at your existing deck of Anki cards, or the next time you're about to make Anki cards, instead of straight away what you would normally do, which is maybe to condense some notes and chuck them on Anki or flashcards or whatever it is that you're attempting to do, instead of doing that, spend a little bit of time just to try to compare some of the ideas against each other and find a way that you can make it almost a little bit more like obvious. What we're basically doing, right, is, and this is like a super simplified version, but it's really just that first single step that someone could take. What we're basically doing is we're saying with the sensory information coming in, and when that sensory information comes into our brain, we have the opportunity at that point to change the way that we think about that information so that we activate a more efficient, what we often call the encoding process, okay, which is this blue arrow, the encoding process. And when we do that well, we're able to store that information in our long-term memory. Okay, and if we can do it really well, we're even able to store that information and use and apply that information at a high level of knowledge, mastery, and depth. A level of depth that most people can only reach after studying something for months or even years, you can achieve after studying it for maybe even a couple of days. If you think about it in the right way, there are certain cognitive shortcuts and there's certain pathways that you can forcibly activate that achieves this, right? It's very complicated. I'm not going to talk about it in this video. So we have the opportunity to use various techniques to activate more efficient encoding pathways and put it in the long-term memory. When we are saying that we're just going to offload this onto flashcards instead, we are essentially saying to ourselves, this is not possible. What I am going to do is I am instead going to use a rote learning process of repetition, and I'm going to offload that into my flashcards. Okay, so this is my deck of cards. And we want to stop that decision. We want to be a little bit more aware of that cognitive pathway. We want to actually make a decision about what it is that we think can be learned in a different form and what we have to resort to with using rote learning. Rote learning, learning through repetition, is necessary for some types of information. And the information that it is suitable for depends on your ability to do the encoding process. If you're really bad at doing the encoding process, and that's not because you're just an idiot, but because you just never learned how to do it properly, which is, by the way, most people, right? A lot of people think that they're like, like a huge idiot because they don't know how to encode properly, but that's not the case. Like, most people are not able to encode effectively because they were never, ever taught, partially because the research on how we can actually teach this has only been available for like the last 5 years. I just almost coincidentally happened to be like neck deep in this right at the moment when this research was coming out, and I was having the experience in consolidating it really, really quickly. So if you don't have a high level of the encoding process, it's not actually possible for you to activate some of these pathways yet. And you can train yourself to do it better and better and better over time. But right now, there's going to be a limit to how much you can do. And so if that's not possible, then we would have to resort to this rote learning. But if we can start detecting what types of information we are able to encode more effectively through another alternative method, if we can start seeing how information can be organized and consolidated and make it not require repetition, if we can make it so that rote learning through flashcards is the last resort, if that's the frame we come from, then that just starts opening the door for other possibilities. And that last resort in the early stages, you may need to use that last resort 90% of the time because you have no other resorts that you've created. But then you can invest a little bit more into practicing these alternatives. And as you get better and better and more proficient at other methods of encoding, you will have more resorts before the last resort. And therefore, you will be able to spend less and less investment into just rote learning through things like flashcards and less things through repetition. And eventually, a very small percentage of the information, you will have to resort to using flashcards. And most of the content, you'll be able to find ways of learning it, through other means. And for the very, very beginner, what I would say is just try to take the information and find a way to think about it that makes it seem really obvious. You can try to relate the information to your prior existing knowledge. Okay, this is something that in the education space, we often talk about as creating an analogous relationship. And yes, that's exactly the same analogous as when we say analogy, creating an analogous relationship where we're saying, hey, this is kind of like this other thing that I learned or that I know about. Finding that way of understanding it, finding those analogies, look for that as an opportunity. And if you can find that, you don't need to put it on the flashcard. Just get used to not putting it on a flashcard. You can write it down in some other notes if you're really insecure about it. And eventually you may not even need to put it down in those other notes at some point, but you can start by just offloading it onto something else and just slowly getting used to the idea of processing the information to a greater and greater depth. And what will happen is that eventually you will have more and more methods and techniques through which you can access this, not just analogous relationships, but you'll be able to form more complex and advanced organizational structures. You'll be able to find more ways of, that thing that we often call chunking. We'll be able to find more effective methods of condensing and compressing information, forcing relevance and encoding it as we practice it. And we will feel more and more secure about that process over time and not need to rely on something like spaced repetition and Anki. And I think it's very important that anyone that's watching this, you're not trying to fix everything in a single go, because you're probably not going to be able to, because the skill hasn't been developed. But it doesn't mean you can't develop the skill. What it means is that you need to focus on what is the immediate next step that you can take that gets you one step closer, because you just keep taking those steps and eventually you're going to be at where you want to be. But if you don't start taking those first steps, that time is going to pass regardless. And 3-4 months from now, you're either going to be there or you're not going to be there. And if you're not there, you may regret not having taken just those first few steps, which by themselves may not have seemed very big or impressive, but they were the first steps on that journey. And that's the most important thing. And that's the thing that I would say, if I can get anyone to take away from that, is to really focus on that.
How is spaced repetition different from interleaving? Because a lot of people mistake interleaving with spaced repetition. Yep, a lot of people think that interleaving just means like, oh, I'll study maths for 30 minutes, science for 30 minutes, English for 30 minutes, instead of doing, and then I'll repeat that 3 times, instead of doing a block, 1 hour for maths, 1 hour for science, 1 hour for English.
So interleaving is actually quite an interesting sort of concept, because it's not a single sort of thing. So often when we look at research on interleaving, it's comparing interleaving to something called massed practice. And massed practice, like MASSED, just talks about just practicing something all in one block. Like you have a single long study session where you cover everything. Interleaving is talking about kind of breaking that up and kind of spreading that with other things in between. But there's another aspect of interleaving. So if you look at some of the older research on interleaving, what we're talking about there is not necessarily the idea of practicing one thing in a block. I mean, it is practicing one thing in a block, but it's also the angle and the way in which we are approaching it at that time. So a classic example that's often given is throwing a basketball. So massed practice for basketball will be to stay at the same spot, same angle of approach, and practice throwing your free throws. Okay, and you practice each shot after shot after shot. Interleaving would be saying you're going to practice this 5 times and you're going to move 1 step to the left and practice that 5 times, and move 10 steps to the right and practice that 5 times. You're going to practice with someone actively trying to block you. You're going to practice with taking a step back. You're going to practice in these different types of angles and pressures and stresses. And so interleaving more broadly, and especially the way that I focus on it, is I really focus a lot more on the idea of breaking up a single session, not necessarily by time, but the idea that we're breaking up our approach with multiple different angles of hitting the same topic. So interleaving and spacing go really, really hand in hand, because in one session, you can approach it in this angle or in a couple of angles cognitively. And in the next session, you can approach it in a couple of different angles. The most common, very easy way of doing this would be like saying, first, I'm going to create a good structure and a frame for this and write some notes about a topic. And then afterwards, in my next session, maybe a couple of days later, I'm going to do some practice papers, some practice questions for it. Same content, but you're approaching it in a different way. It's a very normal way of interleaving that people do. And people that do this find that's a very effective combo. But that's just the surface. You can get even more effective than that, right? So for example, you could say, instead of just answering questions, you make your own questions. So that's another angle. It's actually a different cognitive approach, creating questions versus answering questions. You could even have a group of friends. You create questions for each other, and then you answer each other's questions. but then you don't have an answer sheet. You can make your own answer sheet. Making your own answer sheet is in itself a different angle and an approach. And in fact, a very, very effective approach of learning. So there's all these different angles that we can actually take to cover the same types of information. Now, I've just talked about the ones that are the easiest to understand, but there's a ton. Those of you that are already on my course, I've got the interleaving table. If you are on my course, make sure to look that up. In the dashboard, you can find the interleaving table where there's this huge list of all the different ways that you can cover a certain type of topic for different subjects, different contexts, different time availabilities. There's so many ways that you can hit information where it would give you a really great learning per time. Like 1 hour spent doing that gives you so much benefit. It covers so many gaps and prepares you for assessments and exams, or even your boss grilling you at work. It protects you against more of those, rather than essentially what the worst thing that you can do is, the worst thing that you can do while doing space retrieval, which is to do the same method every time. You just reread your notes again and again and again. You just rewrite your notes and maybe paraphrase it a few times. That's not really doing anything cognitively. You're reaching the saturation of what gain you can get from that, probably the first time you're doing it. And then every time you do it afterwards, it's just a waste of time. Because yes, it may give you 1 or 2% advantage, but compared to the possible 10 to 20% advantage that it gets you doing something else, that's not worth it. The opportunity cost, what you're losing out on by doing that.
Cool. Right. So with this in mind, now that we know that we can actually incorporate interleaving, what's your opinion on the spacing and the intervals between each repetition? Is it really so important to fine tune your settings?
Right. So what we're talking about now is this idea of spacing intervals, and there's this sort of concept on top of space retrieval, which is called expanding gap space retrieval, which just, it's kind of self-explanatory, right? The gap between each interval is expanding. So for example, you do it after 1 day, then you do it after like 2 days, and you do it after like 5 days and whatever. Like Anki and things like that have that built into it. And a few more things on top of that algorithm. So the research on this, in summary, is like kind of inconclusive, but suggests that having longer gaps and expanding that gap is a little bit more beneficial. But you don't have to get it down like super razor sharp. But, and this is really important here, is that it depends a lot on how well you encoded it in the first place. So if we think about the forgetting curve, right, for a second here, our great friend Ebbinghaus created this forgetting curve that said that the first time we look at information, we're going to forget it very quickly. If we repeat it again, we're going to forget it much more slowly. And when we repeat it again, we're going to forget it, even slower than that, right? It's a very simple concept to understand. We intuitively understand it. This is what spaced repetition is based on. So the reason that we have the expanding gap is because it doesn't really make sense to have, one here and then one here. So let's say that by this point, we're at 10%. Okay, so we've forgotten 90% of everything that we learned, which is, by the way, kind of bad. And also it doesn't have to be that way. But let's assume that that's just what's happening. We're forgetting 90% of what we learned after, let's say that the gap here is 2 days. Okay, now research typically suggests that after 1 week, you forget 50 to 60% overall. Okay, but obviously it depends on a lot of things. So if you are then doing it again after 2 days, okay, the amount that you may have forgotten at that point, maybe, here. So it's like 50%. So it may not actually be as time efficient to do it after like every 2 days, because when you leave it for a little bit longer, when the gap for retrieval is a little bit longer, it allows you to kind of replicate the more realistic needs of your retrieval. So for example, if you've got an exam in like a week from now, unless you plan on repeating the same material like every 2 days between now and the exam, you may not ever really test your ability to retrieve it after you leave it for a whole week. So you kind of want to know how much are you forgetting after a week, or after 2 weeks, or after a month. So there's a strategic advantage there. And also you forget different things at different times. And that also gives you an indication of the different weaknesses that you have. However, if you have a low level of encoding and you're forgetting things very quickly, and I would say that in this example, if you're forgetting 90% of what you learned after 2 days, that's a very bad level of encoding. Then you do not have the option of playing around with the expanding interval very much, because every single day you are forgetting so much that if you don't get it if you don't do your retrieval today and you leave it tomorrow, then you may have forgotten so much more in that time that you now have to do so much tomorrow that you literally do not have time. And this is the idea of like flashcard overwhelm. You like miss 2 or 3 days when the cards are due and you do them again later. And now suddenly you have like 600 additional cards you need to do and you're not able to complete it because you physically do not have time. Or, you know, it's very like aggressive in terms of the timing and the intervals. Whereas if you're able to encode it better to begin with, you just fundamentally forget things much slower. And so there's no need to even do a retrieval session here. You could do one over here. And at that point, you still remember, let's say 60% of it, right? So it means that when you encode things better the first time round, you can afford to have a much greater delay between your retrieval sessions. Instead of having to do it every single day or every second day, you can now afford to do it once after the first couple of days or the first 3 days, whatever. And you can do another one roughly a week later, give or take a few days. And you can do another one roughly a few weeks later, give or take a week or two. And it's not really going to matter. The amount of knowledge decay that you're facing is only like 5 or 10% difference. It's not going to be like 50 or 60% difference, which is what would be the case if you had poor encoding to begin with, right? So it's kind of like a nuanced point there. But the other thing is also, it's not time efficient to not have expanding gap space retrieval, regardless. No matter how good or bad your encoding is, having fixed intervals between your spacing attempts is never going to be time efficient because of the fact that, well, most cases, you're always learning new information. So there's always more stuff that you're going to need to retrieve on. So if you're doing something, and if you're doing a fixed retrieval every single however long, as time goes on, the amount you need to cover just grows and grows and grows and grows, right? And so that may actually be unnecessary. If you were to skip one and you were to do it a little bit later, you may have consolidated enough on that previous attempt that you don't actually need to do it 2 days later. You may be able to do it only a week later. And so what that means is that frees up additional time for you to invest in doing better encoding the first time round, because you're now no longer burdened by the need to have fixed retrieval every single, you know, like day or every couple of days. So it's not time efficient to spend heaps of time on just fixed interval space retrieval. Even if you're forgetting a lot, it's better to keep the intervals expanded, because the worst case scenario is that you have a lot of space retrieval that you need to do. Your intervals are very short, and therefore you're never really encoding it properly the first time round, which means you're always consuming more information than you're consolidating, which means that the amount that you need to cover in each retrieval session only ever grows. The fundamental problem is that the encoding is going to be done wrong or not good enough. And therefore, as a result, you're going to forget more. And if you're trying to combat that with just more and more frequent spacing, that actually takes away more and more time from you to be able to fix the fundamental issue, which is how you're encoding in the first place. So there's really a lot of things here. So in summary, basically, have expanding gap space retrieval to start with, but the timing of the spacing, number one, doesn't really matter, but the room for flexibility of that timing is directly proportional to how good you were at encoding it in the first place. And again, I'm not able to get into all of that in like a single YouTube video, or even really on YouTube as a platform in general, because it is just so specific and deep and sequential. It really is like an entire cognitive retraining schedule that has to be followed. So it is a little bit more complicated. So I can't go into that right now, but I have lots of other videos where I talk about that. And again, if you're really keen on jumping through, you can just join the program properly and just go through it from start to finish.